We don't need your old-fashioned recipes, Margaret. We have Google now. Those words from my daughter-in-law still echo in my mind every time I think about that Thanksgiving disaster. What started as my attempt to help with the family feast turned into a catastrophe that exposed just how much my son had changed since marrying Jessica. The turkey was raw, the gravy was a lumpy disaster, and the stuffing was so salty it was inedible. But the real tragedy wasn't the ruined meal. It was watching my family fall apart over something that could have been prevented with a simple phone call to ask for help. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Sullivan, and at 72 years old, I never imagined I'd be sitting in a hotel room on Thanksgiving evening, crying into a room service turkey sandwich while my family celebrated without me. But here I am, and this is the story of how my son's wife decided that Google knew better than 50 years of cooking experience, and how that decision destroyed more than just one holiday meal. I've been cooking Thanksgiving dinner for my family for decades. It started when I was a young bride of 23, married to my dear husband Robert, trying desperately to impress his mother with my culinary skills. Those early years were filled with burnt rolls and oversalted vegetables, but Robert's mother, God bless her soul, never criticized. Instead, she quietly slipped me handwritten recipe cards, each one filled with her neat cursive and little notes in the margins like, "Don't overmix the biscuit dough," and "Always let the turkey rest for 20 minutes." When Robert passed away 8 years ago, cooking became my way of keeping his memory alive. Every holiday, I'd pull out those same recipe cards, now yellow with age and splattered with decades of use, and I'd recreate the meals that had brought our family together year after year. My son Michael grew up eating my cranberry sauce made from fresh berries, my stuffing with sage and thyme that I grew in my own herb garden, and my turkey that was always perfectly golden and juicy. Michael used to tell his friends that nobody cooked like his mother. He'd bring college roommates home for Thanksgiving, and they'd rave about the meal for years afterward. Even after he graduated and moved to Chicago for his job in finance, he'd drive the 4 hours back to our little town of Cedar Falls every November just for my Thanksgiving dinner. That all changed 3 years ago when he met Jessica. Jessica Wright was everything I wasn't. She was 28 to Michael's 35, with a sharp business degree and an even sharper tongue. She worked in marketing for some tech company and seemed to view everything in life as a problem that could be solved with the right app or internet search. She was beautiful in that polished way that comes from expensive salons and designer clothes, and I could see why Michael was smitten. But from our very first meeting, I sensed that Jessica saw me as an obstacle rather than a future family member. She'd smile politely when Michael introduced us, but her eyes would scan me from head to toe, taking in my comfortable shoes, my simple jewelry, and my gray hair that I styled myself at home. I wasn't sophisticated enough for her vision of what her mother-in-law should be. Still, I tried. When they got engaged after only 10 months of dating, I offered to help plan the wedding. Jessica thanked me, but said she had everything handled through a wedding planning app that coordinated everything digitally. When they bought their modern condo in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood, I offered to help them decorate. Jessica politely declined, saying she preferred to work with an interior designer she'd found online. Every gesture of help was met with a polite but firm rejection. I began to understand that Jessica didn't just not need my help, she actively didn't want it. The wedding was beautiful. I'll give her that. Everything was perfectly coordinated, from the white orchid centerpieces to the 5-course meal prepared by a trendy catering company. But it felt cold to me, like a magazine shoot rather than a celebration of love. There were no personal touches, no family traditions, nothing that spoke to who Michael was or where he came from. During the reception, I tried to connect with Jessica by sharing some stories about Michael's childhood. She nodded politely but kept glancing at her phone, checking social media posts of their wedding in real time. When I offered to share some of the family recipes that Michael had grown up loving, she gave me that bright, practiced smile and said, "That's so sweet, Margaret, but I'm more of a modern cook. I find everything I need online." That
should have been my first warning. After the wedding, the distance between Michael and me grew gradually but noticeably. Our weekly phone calls became monthly check-ins. His visits home became shorter and less frequent. Jessica was always busy with work or social commitments, so Michael rarely came alone. When they did visit, Jessica would spend most of the time on her laptop or phone, claiming she had urgent work projects that couldn't wait. I told myself this was normal. Young couples needed time to build their own lives together. I didn't want to be one of those mother-in-laws who couldn't let go. But it hurt to watch my son become a stranger, to see him deferring to Jessica's preferences in everything, from what restaurants they went to how they spent their holidays. Last Thanksgiving was the first year they didn't come home to Cedar Falls. Jessica had convinced Michael that they should start their own traditions, host their own dinner for Jessica's co-workers who didn't have family nearby. Michael called to apologize, sounding genuinely sorry, but resigned to the decision. I spent that Thanksgiving alone for the first time in my life, eating a small turkey breast and watching old movies, trying not to think about the empty chairs around my dining room table. This year, I was determined things would be different. In early October, I called Michael to invite them for Thanksgiving. To my surprise and delight, he said yes immediately. Jessica had some work conference that got canceled at the last minute, so they were free. They'd drive down on Thanksgiving morning and stay through the weekend. I was overjoyed. I immediately began planning the menu, pulling out my recipe box and making lists of ingredients. I'd make all of Michael's favorites: the turkey with my secret herb rub, the stuffing with cranberries and pecans, the green bean casserole that he used to request for his birthday dinners, and my famous pumpkin pie with the graham cracker crust that Robert's mother had taught me to make. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, Jessica called me. This was unusual. She almost never called me directly, preferring to communicate through Michael. "Hi, Margaret," she said in her crisp, professional voice. "I wanted to talk to you about Thanksgiving dinner." "Of course, dear. I'm so excited you're both coming."
Is there anything special you'd like me to make? Actually, that's what I wanted to discuss. Michael and I were talking, and we think it would be fun if we cooked this year. Really contribute to the meal instead of just showing up as guests. My heart sank a little, but I tried to stay positive. That's wonderful, Jessica. I'd love to cook together. We could make it a real family effort. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Well, actually, we were thinking we'd handle the whole meal. Give you a break for once. You've been cooking Thanksgiving dinner for so many years. Don't you think it's time to relax and just enjoy the day? I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Jessica, I appreciate the thought, but I really enjoy cooking the dinner. It's something I look forward to all year. I know, but Michael and I have been watching these amazing cooking shows, and there are so many great recipes online now. We found this incredible website that has step-by-step videos for everything. It'll be an adventure for us. Honey, maybe we could compromise. I could make some dishes, you could make others. Or I could share some of my recipes with you, help you get started. Jessica's laugh was light but somehow dismissive. "Oh, Margaret, that's so sweet, but we don't really need your old-fashioned recipes. We have Google now. Everything's so much more sophisticated than it used to be. We're going to do a modern take on traditional Thanksgiving." The words hit me like a physical blow. Old-fashioned recipes. As if 50 years of perfecting these dishes, of feeding my family with love and care was somehow quaint and outdated. "Jessica," I said carefully, "some of these recipes have been in our family for generations. Michael grew up eating this food. These aren't just recipes, they're traditions." "I understand that, Margaret. Really, I do. But traditions can be updated, don't you think? Michael is excited about trying new things. He's not a little boy anymore who needs his comfort foods." I wanted to argue, to fight for my place in this dinner that had been my responsibility and joy for decades. But something in Jessica's tone told me that this wasn't really a discussion. It was a notification. She'd already decided, probably with Michael's agreement, and they were just informing me of the change.
If that's what you both want, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Great! We'll handle everything. You just relax and be a guest at your own table. Won't that be nice? After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the recipe box that had been sitting on my counter in preparation for the holiday menu planning. The box was old and worn, filled with cards that chronicled not just ingredients and instructions, but memories of every holiday, every special occasion, every time food had brought my family together. I tried to tell myself that Jessica meant well, that she was trying to give me a break. But deep down, I knew this wasn't about giving me rest. This was about erasing me from the tradition, about making it clear that the old ways, my ways, were no longer needed or wanted. Still, I held on to hope. Maybe Jessica would surprise me. Maybe she'd create a wonderful meal and we'd start a new tradition that honored both the old and the new. Maybe I was being too sensitive, too attached to routines that really were outdated. I decided I wouldn't interfere. I'd be the gracious mother-in-law, supportive and encouraging. I'd let them handle everything, and I'd focus on just enjoying time with my son. The week before Thanksgiving, Michael called to confirm their plans. He sounded excited, almost giddy. Mom, you're gonna love what Jessica has planned. She's been researching for weeks, found all these amazing recipes online. She's got everything organized in spreadsheets and timeline charts. It's going to be incredible. I'm sure it will be, sweetheart. I can't wait to see what you two create. And, Mom, thanks for being so cool about letting us take over the cooking. I know how much you love doing the dinner, but Jessica really wanted to prove herself, you know? She feels like she needs to show you that she can take care of me, that she's worthy of being part of the family. His words made me soften a little toward Jessica.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Maybe I had misunderstood her motivations. Maybe this wasn't about dismissing me, but about her own insecurities and desire to belong. Michael, Jessica doesn't need to prove anything to me. She's already part of the family. I know, Mom, but you know how she is. She likes to excel at everything she does. This dinner is really important to her. I promised myself I'd be extra supportive, that I'd help Jessica feel successful and welcomed, no matter what the meal turned out like. They arrived on Thanksgiving morning around 10 o'clock, their car loaded with grocery bags and what looked like enough cooking equipment to stock a restaurant kitchen. Jessica had brought her own knives, her own cutting boards, even her own measuring cups. I like to use my own tools, she explained when she saw me looking at the pile of equipment. Everything needs to be precise. She was dressed like she was going to a business meeting rather than cooking a family meal. Crisp white blouse, tailored black pants, her hair pulled back in a perfect bun. She'd even brought an apron, but it was one of those expensive designer ones that looked like it had never actually been used. Michael seemed energized by the project, rolling up his sleeves and asking Jessica what she needed him to do. For the first hour, I watched them work together, Jessica consulting her tablet constantly, reading instructions aloud while Michael chopped vegetables according to her precise specifications. The recipe says to dice the onions in quarter-inch pieces, Jessica said, measuring Michael's work with an actual ruler. These are a little big. Can you make them smaller? I bit my tongue. In 50 years of cooking, I'd never measured a diced onion, but I reminded myself that Jessica was just being thorough. By noon, the kitchen looked like a hurricane had hit it. Jessica had 3 different tablets and her phone all running various cooking videos and recipe sites. She had timers set for different stages of multiple dishes, and she'd written a complex schedule on my kitchen whiteboard that looked more like a military operation than a holiday meal. Mom, can you stay out of the kitchen today? Michael asked apologetically. Jessica has everything timed out perfectly, and she's worried about too many people disrupting the flow. I retreated to the living room where I tried to read a book, but found myself listening to the increasingly frantic sounds coming from the kitchen.
I heard Jessica's voice getting higher and more stressed as the afternoon wore on. This recipe says 20 minutes, but it's been 30 and the potatoes aren't even close to done. The turkey temperature isn't rising fast enough. This website must be wrong about the cooking time. Why is the gravy lumpy? I followed the video exactly. Around 3 o'clock, I smelled something burning. The old smoke alarm started beeping and I heard Jessica cry out in frustration. The rolls are completely black. How did that happen? I set the timer. I started to get up to help, but Michael appeared in the doorway. It's fine, Mom. Jessica's got it under control. Just a minor setback with the bread. But I could see the stress on his face, and the smell of burnt food was getting stronger. An hour later, Jessica emerged from the kitchen looking like she'd been in a battle. Her perfect hair was disheveled, her white blouse was stained with gravy, and there were tears in her eyes. "Dinner's going to be a little late," she announced, trying to maintain her composure. "Some of the timing got off, but everything is going to be fine." Michael came out behind her, looking equally frazzled. "Maybe we should have made a simpler menu," he said quietly. "No," Jessica snapped, then caught herself and softened her tone. "No, it's fine. I can handle this. I just need to recalculate the cooking times." By 6 o'clock, we finally sat down to eat. The delay had given me time to really look at what Jessica had created, and my heart sunk. The turkey was beautiful on the outside, golden brown and perfectly presented, but when Michael carved into it, the inside was still pink and clearly undercooked. The stuffing was so salty it was nearly inedible. Apparently, Jessica had confused tablespoons with teaspoons in her measurement conversion from the online recipe. The mashed potatoes were lumpy and cold, the green beans were overcooked to the point of being mushy, and the gravy had congealed into something that looked more like pudding. The cranberry sauce was the only thing that turned out well, and that was because Jessica had simply opened a can. But the worst part wasn't the food. It was watching Jessica's face crumble as she realized the extent of the disaster. She took one bite of the turkey, her expression shifting from determined optimism to horror as she realized it was raw. "I don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I followed every instruction exactly. I watched the videos 3 times each. The internet said this would work." Michael tried gamely to eat the meal, but even he couldn't hide his disappointment. This was the man who had driven 4 hours every year just to eat my Thanksgiving dinner, now sitting in front of a table full of inedible food on his favorite holiday. "It's okay, honey," he said to Jessica, but I could hear the strain in his voice.
Jessica looked at me across the table, and for the first time since I'd known her, her perfect composure completely cracked. "I'm sorry, Margaret," she whispered, tears starting to flow. "I thought I could do this. I thought I could make it perfect." And in that moment, despite everything, my heart broke for her. This young woman who had dismissed my recipes, who had pushed me out of my own kitchen, was just trying to prove that she belonged, that she could take care of my son the way I had. But she'd learned too late that some things can't be Googled. Some knowledge comes only from experience, from the kind of intuition that develops over decades of practice, from understanding not just the science of cooking, but the art of it. "Jessica," I said gently, "would you like me to call for Chinese takeout? There's a good place that delivers, even on holidays." She nodded miserably, unable to speak. As we waited for our replacement dinner to arrive, Jessica excused herself to the bathroom. I could hear her crying through the door, and Michael sat slumped at the table, staring at the ruins of what should have been our family feast. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said finally. "I should have known this would happen. Jessica's never cooked anything more complicated than pasta. But she was so determined, so sure she could figure it out from the internet." "Why didn't you tell her about my recipes?" I asked quietly. "Why didn't you suggest she ask me for help?" Michael was quiet for a long moment. "Because she specifically said she didn't want your help. She said she needed to do this herself, to prove that she didn't need anyone else's methods. She called your recipes old-fashioned and said she could find better, more modern versions online." The words stung all over again. "And you agreed with her?" "I didn't know what to say, Mom. Jessica gets really determined about things, and when she makes up her mind, it's hard to change it. I thought maybe she was right, that there might be better ways to do things now. Better ways than what, Michael? He looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen since he was a little boy. Uncertainty, regret, a need for guidance that he'd been too proud or too influenced to ask for. Better than the way you taught me, he said softly. But sitting here now, looking at this mess, all I can think about is how perfect your dinners always were, how the house smelled like herbs and turkey all day, how you somehow managed to have everything ready at exactly the right time, how it all just came together like magic. It wasn't magic, sweetheart. It was 50 years of practice. It was learning from mistakes, adjusting recipes based on experience, understanding how my oven works differently from someone else's. It was cooking with love instead of just following instructions. Jessica came back from the bathroom, her makeup fixed but her eyes still red. "The food should be here in 30 minutes, I announced, trying to lighten the mood. "And you know what? We're still together, we're still family, and we'll still have a good evening." Jessica sat down heavily in her chair. "Margaret, I owe you an apology. I was arrogant and dismissive, and I ruined Thanksgiving for everyone." "You didn't ruin anything, dear. You tried something new, and it didn't work out. That happens to everyone. But I was so rude to you about your recipes. I acted like they weren't important, like your experience didn't matter. I was wrong." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Jessica, can I tell you something? Every recipe in my box represents a lesson learned. The first time I made turkey, it was so dry we could barely choke it down. The first time I tried to make gravy from scratch, it was so lumpy Robert joked that we should use it as wallpaper paste. But each time I cooked, I learned something new. I adjusted, I adapted, I got better." Jessica looked at me with new interest. "You mean you weren't always good at this?" "Honey, I was terrible when I started. But Robert's mother taught me that cooking isn't just about following directions. It's about understanding your ingredients, knowing your equipment, and most importantly, accepting that failure is part of the learning process." "I don't like failing," Jessica admitted. "In my job, in my life, I'm used to being able to research everything thoroughly and execute perfectly the first time." "Cooking isn't like that," I said. "Cooking is messy and unpredictable and requires intuition that can only come from experience. But that's what makes it beautiful." Michael had been listening to our conversation intently. "Mom," he said, "would you be willing to teach Jessica your recipes?"
"The real ones, with all the tips and tricks you never wrote down?" Jessica looked at me hopefully. "Would you? I promise I'll listen this time. I'll be a better student than I was today." I squeezed her hand. "I would love nothing more than to share those recipes with you, Jessica. But more than that, I'd love to share the stories that go with them, the memories they represent, the love that goes into every dish." When the Chinese food arrived, we spread it out on my good china and ate by candlelight, just like we would have with the traditional dinner. Jessica asked me to tell her about some of my favorite holiday memories. And for the first time since I'd known her, she put away her phone and really listened. I told her about the year Michael was 8 and insisted on helping make the pumpkin pie, ending up with more filling on himself than in the crust. I told her about the time Robert's father ate 3 helpings of my stuffing and declared it better than his own mother's, which was the highest compliment he'd ever given anyone. I told her about the recipe cards that had been passed down through generations, each one containing not just ingredients, but love. "I want to learn all of it," Jessica said. "Not just the recipes, but the traditions, the stories, the way you make everything feel so warm and welcoming." "It's not about perfection, Jessica. It's about intention. When you cook for people you love, when you put care into every step, when you understand that feeding your family is an act of love, that's when food becomes something more than just nutrients on a plate." As the evening wound down, we made plans for Jessica to come back the following weekend for cooking lessons. She wanted to start with the basics: how to make a proper gravy, how to tell when meat is done without relying solely on thermometers, how to adjust seasonings by taste rather than just following measurements. "I realize now that I was threatened by your experience," Jessica confided as Michael loaded their car for the drive back to Chicago. You make everything look so effortless, and I felt like I could never measure up. So instead of asking for help, I decided to prove I didn't need it. Jessica, you don't need to measure up to anyone. You just need to be yourself and be open to learning. That's all any of us can do. She hugged me goodbye, and for the first time, it felt genuine and warm instead of obligatory. As I watched their car pull away, I reflected on how the day had unfolded. Yes, the dinner had been a disaster. Yes, we'd ended up eating Chinese takeout instead of turkey. But something more important had happened. Jessica had learned humility, Michael had remembered the value of family traditions, and I had gained a daughter-in-law who finally wanted to connect with me. Sometimes the most important lessons come from failure, and sometimes the best conversations happen over takeout containers instead of perfectly prepared feasts. The next morning, Jessica called me bright and early. Margaret, I've been thinking about our cooking lessons, and I have an idea. Instead of just learning your recipes, what if we create a cookbook together? Your traditional recipes with your stories and tips, but formatted in a modern way that other people could use too. We could even make videos of you teaching the techniques. I was intrigued. What would we do with it? Well, we could start a blog, maybe even turn it into a small business. There are so many people out there who want to learn traditional cooking, but don't have grandmothers or mother-in-laws to teach them. You could be their teacher. The idea excited me more than I wanted to admit. Here was a chance to share not just my recipes, but the love and tradition behind them with people who really wanted to learn. I think that sounds wonderful, Jessica. And Margaret, thank you for yesterday. Thank you for being gracious when I was awful, for teaching me that some things can't be Googled, and for showing me what it really means to cook with love. As I hung up the phone, I realized that this Thanksgiving, despite all its disasters, had given me something I never expected: a deeper relationship with my daughter-in-law, a renewed sense of purpose, and proof that sometimes failure is just the first step towards something better. Google might have all the recipes in the world, but it will never have the love, patience, and wisdom that comes from a grandmother's kitchen. And sometimes that makes all the difference. The next weekend after Thanksgiving, Jessica arrived at my house with 3 notebooks, a tablet, and the kind of determined expression I remembered from my teaching days when a struggling student finally decided they were ready to learn. She'd driven down from Chicago alone, leaving Michael to catch up on work, and she seemed different somehow. Softer around the edges, less armored against the world. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began as we settled in my kitchen with coffee, "about cooking being more than just following instructions. I realized I approach everything in my life like it's a business problem to be solved, but maybe that's not the right way to think about feeding people you love." I smiled, remembering my own journey from rigid rule-following to intuitive cooking. "Tell me, Jessica, when you were growing up, did anyone cook for you? Did you have family meals?" Her expression grew distant. "My parents both worked long hours. Mom was a lawyer, Dad was in consulting. We ate a lot of takeout, frozen dinners, restaurant meals. Nobody really cooked. When they divorced when I was 15, it got even worse. I learned to make sandwiches and heat up soup, but that was about it." The picture became clearer. Jessica hadn't dismissed my cooking knowledge out of malice, but out of unfamiliarity. She'd never experienced the kind of nurturing that comes from homemade meals. Never understood that cooking could be an expression of love, rather than just a chore to be completed efficiently. So when you met Michael and heard him talk about family dinners and holiday traditions, what did that feel like to you? Jessica stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "Intimidating, honestly. He'd describe these elaborate meals you'd make, how the whole house smelled amazing, how everyone would sit around the table for hours just talking and laughing. It sounded wonderful, but also completely foreign. I felt like I could never create that kind of atmosphere." And rather than ask for help, you decided to prove you could figure it out on your own. That's what I always do, in business school, at work, in relationships. I research, I prepare, I execute. It's worked for everything else in my life. She paused, looking around my kitchen with its well-worn surfaces and collected treasures. But sitting here now, I realize I was missing the most important ingredient, which is The stories, the history, the understanding that these recipes aren't just instructions, they're connections to people and memories and love passed down through generations. I reached for my recipe box and pulled out one of the most worn cards. This is my turkey recipe, but it's not really mine. It started with Robert's grandmother, then his mother added her own touches, then I modified it based on our family's preferences and my own discoveries over the years. By the time I'm done teaching it to you, it will become partly yours too. Jessica leaned forward, studying the card with its faded writing and stained edges. Tell me about the first time you made it. It was our second Thanksgiving as a married couple. Robert's mother was sick that year, so she asked me to host. I was terrified. 24 years old and responsible for feeding 12 people, including Robert's very opinionated aunts who had strong feelings about how everything should be prepared. I could still remember that day clearly, the way my hands shook as I seasoned the turkey, how I called Robert's mother 3 times to double-check the cooking time, how I stood in front of the oven for the last hour afraid to leave the kitchen. I followed her recipe exactly, but something went wrong. The turkey finished cooking an hour earlier than it should have. I panicked, called Robert's mother crying, convinced I'd ruined everything. She laughed and told me that ovens vary, that recipes are guidelines, not laws. She talked me through how to check if meat is really done, how to keep it warm without drying it out, and how to make adjustments on the fly. What happened? The dinner was delicious. Not perfect, but delicious. And more importantly, I learned that cooking isn't about precision, it's about adaptation. About using your senses and your judgment, not just following someone else's timeline. Jessica opened her first notebook. Can you teach me that? Not just the recipe, but how to trust my instincts? We spent the next 4 hours in my kitchen, and I watched Jessica transform from someone who measured everything with scientific precision to someone who was beginning to understand that cooking is as much art as science. I taught her how to feel the texture of properly creamed butter, how to tell when onions are truly translucent, how the smell of herbs changes as they cook. The internet can tell you to cook onions for 5 minutes, but it can't tell you that your onions might need 7 minutes because they're larger, or that the humidity today means they'll release more water, or that your pan runs hot and you need to turn down the heat. Jessica nodded, taking notes, but also really watching, really paying attention to the small details that no video could capture. I think I understand now why my Thanksgiving was such a disaster. I was cooking for the recipe, not for the people. I was so focused on following instructions perfectly that I forgot the point was to create something delicious. Exactly. And when something went wrong, you didn't have the experience to problem solve. You just knew it wasn't matching what the internet told you it should be.
We moved on to the cranberry sauce, one of the simplest dishes, but one that reveals so much about the difference between cooking and following directions. The recipe calls for 1 cup of sugar, I said, but taste this. I handed her a spoon of the mixture. She made a face. It's too sweet. Now try it with 3/4 a cup. I adjusted the mixture and had her taste again. That's much better, more balanced. The recipe doesn't know that this batch of cranberries is particularly tart, or that our family prefers things less sweet, or that you're planning to serve this with other sweet dishes. Only you can make those judgments. Jessica scribbled notes furiously. So the recipe is just a starting point. Think of it as a conversation between you and the ingredients. The recipe introduces you, but then you have to listen to what the food is telling you and respond accordingly. As the afternoon wore on, I watched Jessica begin to relax into the process. She stopped checking her timer constantly and started using her nose and eyes to judge doneness.
She tasted and adjusted seasonings without referring to measurements. Most importantly, she started to smile while she cooked. "This is actually fun," she admitted as we worked on the gravy, "when you're not terrified of making mistakes." Mistakes are how you learn. I once added salt instead of sugar to a batch of cookies. Instead of throwing them out, I decided to see what would happen. They were terrible as cookies, but crushed up, they made an interesting coating for chicken. You turned a mistake into something useful? That's what good cooks do. We adapt, we experiment, we find creative solutions. The internet can't teach you that because it doesn't know what mistakes you're going to make or what ingredients you have on hand to fix them. By evening, Jessica had successfully made stuffing, cranberry sauce, and gravy from scratch, each one adjusted and perfected through tasting and instinct, rather than rigid adherence to measurements. "I want to try the turkey next weekend," she said as we cleaned up. "But I want Michael to be here for that. I want him to see me learning from you, to understand that I'm not trying to replace your traditions, but to become part of them." The following Saturday, they both came down to Cedar Falls. Michael seemed surprised by the change in Jessica's attitude, the way she deferred to my experience and asked questions instead of asserting her own methods. "Mom," he said quietly while Jessica was setting up her notebooks, "what did you do to my wife? She's been talking about nothing but cooking all week. She even bought actual measuring spoons to replace the ones that came with our apartment." "I didn't do anything, sweetheart. I just showed her that cooking is about more than following instructions. It's about understanding and intuition and love." She called me from the grocery store 3 times yesterday asking about different brands of butter. She's never cared about ingredients before. I watched Jessica carefully arranging her supplies, the same methodical approach she'd brought to the disastrous Thanksgiving, but now tempered with genuine curiosity instead of stubborn determination. She's learning that quality ingredients matter, that the choices you make in shopping affect the final result. That's good. The turkey lesson was more complex than our previous sessions. There's so much that can go wrong with a large bird, so many variables that affect cooking time and temperature, but Jessica approached it with the patience she'd learned during our first lesson. "Tell me about the brine," she said, studying my recipe card. "Why do you soak it overnight? What does that actually do?" "It's about moisture and flavor distribution. The salt breaks down some of the protein fibers, which helps the meat hold on to moisture during cooking. But more than that, it gives the seasonings time to penetrate throughout the meat, not just sit on the surface." I showed her how to test the brine's saltiness, how to adjust the seasonings based on the size of the bird, how to tell when the turkey had absorbed enough flavor. "This is what I was missing on Thanksgiving," Jessica realized. "I thought I could just rub some salt on the skin and call it seasoned." Michael joined us for the actual roasting lesson, fascinated despite himself by the techniques his mother had been using all his life without his really noticing. "Mom, how do you know when it's done? You never seem to use the thermometer very much." I showed them both how to check the joint movement, the way the skin looks when properly rendered, the sound the juices make when they hit the pan. The thermometer is useful, but it's just one piece of information. You need to use all your senses. Jessica was taking notes on everything, but I could see she was also really absorbing the concepts, beginning to understand the why behind each step rather than just memorizing the how. "I feel like I'm learning a completely different language," she said as we waited for the turkey to finish cooking. "Before, I thought cooking was just chemistry. Combine ingredients in specific proportions, apply heat for a specific time, get a predictable result. What do you think it is now?" "It's more like music, maybe. You learn the basic techniques, but then you have to interpret them based on your own taste and the specific situation. The same song can sound completely different depending on who's playing it." Michael smiled. "That's a perfect analogy. Mom's turkey never tastes exactly the same twice, but it's always delicious because she adjusts based on the specific bird, the weather, the oven temperature, whatever variables come up." When the turkey was finally ready, golden and aromatic and perfectly cooked, Jessica looked at it with something approaching reverence. "I did that," she said wonderfully. "I mean, with your guidance, but I actually made something beautiful?" "I think you did more than that," I told her. "You learned how to pay attention, how to trust your instincts, how to adjust and adapt. Those skills will serve you in every recipe you ever try." We spent the rest of the evening eating our small feast and talking about family traditions, about the ways food connects us to our history and to each other. Jessica asked about other family recipes, about holiday customs, about the stories behind various dishes. "I want to host Christmas dinner at our place in Chicago. I want to cook for Michael's extended family, show them that I can take care of him properly."
I felt a moment of panic at the thought of Jessica taking on such an ambitious meal after only 2 lessons. But then I saw the confidence in her expression, the way she was already planning and problem-solving in her head. That sounds wonderful, dear.
What can I do to help? Would you come, not to take over, but to be there in case I need advice? I want to do it myself, but I'd feel so much better knowing you were nearby if something goes wrong. Of course I'll come. I'd be honored to be your sous chef for the day. Michael looked back and forth between us, amazement clear on his face. I can't believe how much has changed since Thanksgiving. A month ago, you two could barely be in the same room together without tension. Now you're planning Christmas dinner as a team. Jessica reached over and squeezed my hand. Your mother saved Christmas, Michael. She taught me that I don't have to choose between being independent and accepting help. I can learn from her experience without losing my own identity. And Jessica taught me that sharing knowledge isn't about proving I'm needed, I added. It's about passing on something valuable to someone who truly wants to learn. As they prepared to drive back to Chicago that evening, Jessica hugged me with the genuine warmth that had been missing from all our previous interactions. Thank you, Margaret, for being patient with me, for teaching me not just recipes, but wisdom. I understand now why Michael always spoke so lovingly about your cooking. It wasn't just about the food. What was it about? It was about feeling cared for, feeling like someone took the time and effort to make something special just for you. That's what I want to learn to do for our family. After they left, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the lingering aromas of our cooking session, feeling more content than I had in years. Jessica's transformation had been remarkable, but more than that, it had rekindled my own joy in cooking. Teaching her had reminded me why I'd fallen in love with feeding people in the first place. The phone rang around 9 o'clock. It was Jessica. Margaret, I hope I'm not calling too late. I just wanted to thank you again and to ask if you'd be willing to start planning the Christmas menu with me. I have some ideas, but I want to make sure I'm not being too ambitious. I'd love to plan with you, dear. What did you have in mind? Well, I was thinking about what you said about cooking being a conversation with the ingredients. I want to make some traditional dishes that Michael remembers from childhood, but I also want to add a few things that reflect who I am, what I bring to the family. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense. Jessica was learning to honor tradition while also making it her own. Exactly the kind of evolution that keeps family customs alive and meaningful. That sounds perfect, Jessica. Why don't you come down next weekend and we'll work on the menu together? Actually, I was wondering if you'd consider coming up here. I want to practice cooking in my own kitchen, get comfortable with my own equipment. Plus, I'd love to show you around Chicago, take you to some of the markets I've been discovering. The invitation surprised me. In 3 years of knowing Jessica, she'd never suggested I visit their home. I'd been there exactly once for a brief stop during a family gathering, and she'd seemed anxious to have me leave. Are you sure? I don't want to impose. Margaret, you're not imposing. You're my cooking teacher and your mother-in-law, and I want you to feel welcome in our home. Besides, I think you'll be impressed by the changes I've made to the kitchen. Changes? Jessica laughed. Let's just say I've invested in some proper equipment and ingredients, the kind of stuff you can't get from a takeout menu. The following weekend, I took the train up to Chicago, something I hadn't done in years. Jessica met me at Union Station, and I was struck again by how different she seemed. Still polished and professional, but warmer, more relaxed. Their condo had indeed been transformed. The sterile, magazine-perfect kitchen I remembered had been replaced with something that actually looked like a place where people cooked. There were herbs growing on the windowsill, a proper wooden cutting board on the counter, and a knife block filled with good quality blades.
I threw out all the kitchen gadgets I'd bought online, Jessica explained, showing me around. You know, the things that claim to make cooking easier but really just complicated it. Instead, I invested in basic, high-quality tools. This is beautiful, Jessica. It feels like a kitchen where someone actually enjoys cooking. I'm starting to, thanks to you. Michael can hardly believe it.
Last night, I made him a completely improvised dinner based on what was in the refrigerator. No recipe at all. He said it was delicious. We spent the afternoon exploring Chicago's food markets, Jessica introducing me to vendors she'd gotten to know, showing off her newfound knowledge of seasonal ingredients and quality indicators. I've been coming here every Saturday, she said, as we browsed through perfectly arranged vegetables at the Green City Market, learning about what's in season, talking to the farmers about how they grow things, understanding that good ingredients are the foundation of good cooking. I watched her select winter squash with the confidence of someone who knew what to look for, saw her chatting easily with the cheese vendor about pairing flavors for our Christmas menu. This wasn't the same woman who dismissed my recipes in favor of Google searches. Jessica, I said as we walked through the market with our bags full of ingredients, I'm proud of you, not just for learning to cook, but for approaching it with such genuine curiosity and respect. I have a good teacher. And more than that, I finally understand what I was missing all those years eating takeout and frozen dinners. I was missing the connection that comes from preparing food with your own hands, from understanding where ingredients come from and how they work together. Back in her kitchen, we worked on refining the Christmas menu. Jessica had ideas that were creative but grounded in solid technique, dishes that would complement traditional favorites while adding her own personality to the meal. I want to do a twist on your green bean casserole, she explained, showing me her notes. Same basic concept, but with fresh haricots verts from the farmer's market and a homemade mushroom sauce instead of canned soup. That sounds wonderful. What gave you that idea? I was thinking about what you said about making recipes your own. Your green bean casserole is perfect for what it is, but I wanted to create something that honored the spirit of it while reflecting the ingredients I have access to here in the city. It was exactly the right approach, respectful of tradition while allowing for personal expression and growth. We spent the evening cooking together, Jessica's kitchen now filled with the same warmth and delicious aromas that had always characterized mine. Michael came home to find us both covered in flour, laughing over a batch of dinner rolls that had risen more than expected. This is what I always hoped for, he said, looking back and forth between us with obvious happiness. My two favorite women working together, enjoying each other's company. Your wife is becoming quite the cook, I told him. By Christmas, she's going to surprise everyone. She's already surprised me. Last week, she made a roast chicken that was better than anything we've ever ordered from a restaurant. Jessica blushed at the praise. I'm still learning, but I'm starting to understand what you meant about cooking with love instead of just following instructions. When I'm preparing food for people I care about, it feels completely different from when I was just trying to execute a recipe perfectly. After dinner, Jessica showed me the cookbook project she'd been working on. She'd taken our lessons and expanded them into detailed guides that captured not just ingredients and techniques, but the philosophy behind traditional cooking. I want other people to understand what I learned from you, she explained, flipping through pages of carefully organized recipes and stories. That cooking isn't just about feeding people, it's about connecting with them, about carrying forward traditions while making them your own. Jessica, this is incredible. You've captured things I never would have thought to write down. That's because you cook with intuition now, but for people like me who are just learning, it helps to have the reasoning explained. Why do we do this step? What are we looking for? How do we know when it's right? The cookbook was organized around the same principles Jessica had learned during our lessons, starting with quality ingredients, understanding basic techniques, learning to trust your senses, and always cooking with love and intention. I've been thinking we could offer cooking classes too, she said. Not just the recipes, but the whole philosophy. Teaching people that good cooking isn't about expensive equipment or complicated techniques. It's about patience and attention and caring about the people you're feeding. The idea excited me more than I'd expected. Here was a chance to share not just my recipes, but the deeper understanding that had taken me decades to develop with people who really wanted to learn. I think that's a wonderful idea, Jessica. When would we start? After Christmas. I want to make sure I can actually cook a successful holiday meal before I start teaching other people how to do it.
Over the next few weeks, Jessica and I talked almost daily, planning every detail of the Christmas dinner. She practiced individual dishes, sent me photos for feedback, called with questions about timing and preparation. But more than that, she shared her growing confidence and joy in cooking. I made your pie crust recipe 3 times this week. The first one was tough, the second was better, and the third was actually flaky and delicious. I think I'm finally getting the hang of not overworking the dough. That's exactly how learning works. Each attempt teaches you something new about the process. I understand now why you never wanted to give up cooking the holiday meals. It's not just about the food, it's about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with your own hands, something that brings joy to people. Christmas Day arrived cold and snowy, perfect weather for a cozy family gathering. Jessica had invited Michael's aunts, his cousins, and several family friends, the same group that used to gather at my house for holiday meals. I arrived early to help with final preparations, but I found Jessica calm and organized, everything proceeding smoothly according to the detailed timeline she had created. "How are you feeling?" I asked, as she basted the turkey with confident, practiced movements. "Good. Nervous, but good nervous."
Excited. Nervous. I know I can do this because I understand what I'm doing instead of just following someone else's instructions. The meal was spectacular. Every dish was perfectly executed, but more than that, each one reflected Jessica's growing understanding of how flavors work together, how presentation affects enjoyment, how timing creates the kind of seamless dinner party that seems effortless but requires careful planning. "Jessica, this is incredible," said Michael's Aunt Linda, the same woman who'd been skeptical of Jessica for years. "Everything tastes like it came from someone who's been cooking for decades." "I had an excellent teacher," Jessica replied, smiling at me across the table. "And more importantly, I learned that good cooking isn't about showing off or proving anything. It's about caring for people." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, several people asked Jessica for recipes. But instead of just handing out ingredient lists, she talked about techniques and principles, sharing the same kind of wisdom I'd passed on to her. "Come take a class with us in the new year," she suggested to one of Michael's cousins. "We're going to teach not just recipes, but the understanding behind them." After everyone had gone home, the 3 of us sat in Jessica's beautifully appointed living room, full of good food and satisfied with a day well done. "I can't believe how much has changed since Thanksgiving," Michael said, echoing the thoughts we'd all been having. "Jessica, you've become the kind of cook my mom always was, someone who makes everything look easy because you really understand what you're doing. And, more than that," I added, "you've made this tradition your own while still honoring what came before. That's exactly what each generation should do." Jessica curled up next to Michael on their couch, looking more relaxed and content than I'd ever seen her. "I learned something important this year, Margaret. I learned that accepting help and guidance doesn't make me weak or dependent. It makes me part of something larger, part of a family and a tradition that's bigger than just me. And I learned that sharing knowledge isn't about maintaining control. It's about ensuring that important things survive and grow and continue to bring joy to new generations." As I prepared to head back to Cedar Falls the next morning, Jessica walked me to the train station carrying a bag full of leftover food and a folder full of notes from our Christmas cooking session. "Thank you, Margaret, for everything, for being patient with my stubbornness, for teaching me not just how to cook, but why it matters, for welcoming me into your family traditions. Thank you for being willing to learn, Jessica, for bringing new energy and ideas to old recipes, for helping me remember why I love cooking in the first place." She hugged me goodbye, and I realized that this difficult year had given me something I never expected. Not just a daughter-in-law who could cook, but a true partner in preserving and evolving the traditions that make families strong. The cookbook we were creating together would be more than just recipes. It would be a guide to building connections through food, to understanding that the best meals aren't about perfection, but about love. And the cooking classes we plan to teach would help other families learn what Jessica and I had discovered, that food is never just about nutrition, it's about nurturing relationships and creating memories that last long after the dishes are washed.
Google might have infinite recipes, but it could never provide what Jessica had found in my kitchen, the wisdom that comes from generations of women who understood that feeding people well is one of the most powerful ways to show love. 6 months after Christmas, Jessica and I officially launched Heritage Kitchen, our cooking school and cookbook venture. What started as a simple idea to share family recipes had grown into something neither of us anticipated. We'd rented a charming Victorian house in downtown Cedar Falls, converting the spacious kitchen into a teaching space while keeping the cozy, homey atmosphere that made people feel welcome. Our first class was scheduled for a Saturday morning in late June, and I was more nervous than I'd been in years. Teaching Jessica one-on-one in my own kitchen was entirely different from standing in front of a group of strangers trying to explain techniques I'd been using intuitively for decades. What if I can't explain it properly? I worried aloud as Jessica and I arranged ingredients on the teaching stations. What if they ask questions I don't know how to answer? Jessica looked up from the recipe card she was organizing, her expression both amused and reassuring. Margaret, you've been teaching me for months, and look how much I've learned. You have a gift for breaking down complex techniques into understandable steps. Plus, that's why we're a team. I can handle the technical explanations while you demonstrate the intuitive parts. The dynamic between Jessica and I had evolved into something beautiful and complementary. She brought organizational skills and the ability to articulate the science behind cooking techniques, while I provided the experiential knowledge and the stories that gave context to each recipe. Together, we created an atmosphere that was both educational and nurturing. Our first students began arriving around 9 that morning. There was Eleanor, a retired teacher who'd never learned to cook because she'd been caring for her elderly mother for years. Patricia brought her teenage daughter Sarah, hoping to bridge a generational gap through shared learning. David, a recently divorced father of 2, wanted to be able to cook proper meals for his children instead of relying on fast food and frozen dinners.
Welcome to Heritage Kitchen, Jessica began, her professional background serving her well as she addressed the group. Today, we're going to learn that cooking isn't about following recipes perfectly. It's about understanding ingredients, developing your palate, and most importantly, cooking with intention and love. I watched the faces of our students as Jessica spoke, seeing the same mixture of hope and nervousness that I remembered from Jessica's first lesson in my kitchen. These were people who wanted to create meaningful meals for their families, but felt intimidated by the gap between their aspirations and their current skills. Before we start cooking, I added, I want each of you to tell us why you're here. What do you hope to accomplish today? Eleanor spoke first, her voice soft but determined. My mother passed away 3 months ago, and I realized I never learned to make any of the dishes she used to prepare for holidays. I want to be able to carry on some traditions, even if it's just for myself. Patricia squeezed her daughter's hand. Sarah and I used to cook together when she was little, but somewhere along the way we stopped. Now she's 17 and about to leave for college, and I want us to have something special to share again. David cleared his throat, clearly emotional. Since my divorce, I've been feeding my kids nothing but takeout and microwaved meals. They deserve better. I want to be the kind of father who can make them a real Sunday dinner. As each person shared their story, I felt the familiar warmth that came from understanding that food was never really about the food. It was about connection, about love made tangible, about creating memories and maintaining traditions that bind families together across generations. Today, we're going to learn to make 3 dishes, Jessica announced, moving to the demonstration counter. A basic roast chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, and green beans with almonds. Simple comfort food that will give you the confidence to start cooking for the people you love. I took over the chicken demonstration, my hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of seasoning and trusting, while I explained the reasoning behind each step. The most important thing to understand about cooking meat, I said, is that every piece is different. Your chicken might be larger or smaller than mine. Your oven might run hot or cold. The humidity today might affect cooking time. Recipes can give you guidelines, but you have to learn to use your senses. I showed them how to feel for the right texture when seasoning, how to listen for the sound of proper searing, how to smell the difference between browning and burning. This is what Jessica and I call cooking conversation, I continued. The food talks to you through sight, sound, smell, and touch.
Your job is to learn its language. As the students worked at their individual stations, I moved among them, offering guidance and encouragement. Eleanor was tentative at first, measuring everything precisely and seeking constant reassurance. But as the morning progressed, I watched her begin to trust her instincts, tasting and adjusting seasonings with growing confidence. Sarah, despite her initial teenager reluctance, became fascinated by the science Jessica explained, asking detailed questions about why salt draws out moisture and how heat transforms proteins. Patricia watched her daughter with obvious joy, clearly treasured this shared discovery. David surprised everyone, including himself, with his natural intuition for cooking. His hands were gentle with the food, and he seemed to understand instinctively when something was ready or needed more time. "I think I might actually be good at this," he said wondrously, as his chicken emerged from the oven perfectly golden and aromatic. "You are good at this," I assured him. "You're paying attention, you're being patient, and you're cooking with care. Those are the only real requirements." As we sat down to eat the meal we'd prepared together, the conversation flowed naturally, from cooking techniques to family stories, from favorite childhood foods to dreams of future dinner parties. I realized that this was exactly what I'd hoped our classes would become, not just cooking instruction, but community building, a place where people could connect over the universal experience of feeding and being fed. "This is incredible," Eleanor said, tears in her eyes as she tasted her perfectly cooked chicken. "I never thought I could make something like this. My mother would be so proud." Patricia nodded enthusiastically. "Sarah, we have to do this together at home. I want to learn all the recipes your great-grandmother used to make." "Can we come back for more classes?" David asked. "I want to learn how to make a proper holiday meal for my kids." Jessica and I exchanged glances, both of us thinking the same thing. This was bigger than we'd anticipated. These people weren't just learning to cook, they were reclaiming the ability to nurture their families, to create the kind of memories that last generations. Word spread quickly through Cedar Falls and beyond. By August, we were offering classes 3 times a week and had a waiting list that stretched into the fall. Our students ranged from young parents wanting to feed their families better, to empty nesters rediscovering the joy of cooking, to college students learning life skills their busy childhoods had somehow skipped. Each class brought new stories, new challenges, and new rewards. There was Marcus, whose grandmother's cornbread recipe had been lost when she passed, working with us to recreate it from his childhood memories and a few clues scribbled on an old envelope. There was Linda, learning to cook gluten-free versions of traditional dishes for her newly diagnosed celiac daughter. There was James, a professional chef who wanted to understand the emotional component of cooking that his culinary school had never addressed. "Every recipe tells a story," became Jessica's favorite saying during our classes. Our job is to help you discover what story you want your cooking to tell. The cookbook was also taking shape beautifully. Jessica had organized it around the principles we taught in our classes, starting with high-quality ingredients, mastering basic techniques, learning to cook by taste and intuition rather than rigid measurement, and always remembering that the best ingredient is love. But more than just recipes, the book included the stories behind the dishes, the history of techniques, and the philosophy that good cooking is about nourishing people on multiple levels. Jessica interviewed several of our students, including their personal journeys from kitchen anxiety to cooking confidence. "I want readers to understand that anyone can learn to cook well," Jessica explained as we reviewed the manuscript together. "It's not about natural talent or expensive equipment. It's about patience, attention, and the willingness to learn from mistakes." The seasonal nature of cooking became a central theme in both our classes and our book. I taught students to recognize the difference between tomatoes in July and tomatoes in January, to understand why some recipes work better in humid weather while others are perfect for dry winter days. Cooking isn't just about following instructions, I would tell each new group of students. It's about developing a relationship with food, understanding how ingredients behave in different conditions, learning to adapt and respond, rather than just execute. Jessica supplemented my intuitive teaching with scientific explanations that helped students understand the why behind the techniques. She could explain the protein structures that made some meats tough and others tender, the chemical reactions that created flavors during browning, the physics of emulsification that turned oil and vinegar into smooth dressing. "Margaret cooks like a poet," she would tell students, "but poetry follows rules even when it seems to break them. Understanding the rules gives you the freedom to be creative." One particularly memorable class involved a disaster that turned into one of our best teaching moments. Maria, a nervous home cook who'd signed up hoping to learn to make tamales for their family's Christmas celebration, accidentally added salt instead of sugar to her masa. Instead of starting over, I encouraged her to taste the mixture and think about how we might use this mistake. What if we turned this into a savory base instead of sweet?
What could we fill it with that would complement the salty flavor? Working together, we created a completely new dish filled with spiced vegetables and cheese. Maria's mistake became the hit of the tasting portion of class, and several other students asked for the recipe. This is what real cooking is about, I told the group. Not following directions perfectly, but understanding your ingredients well enough to adapt when things don't go as planned. Jessica documented the entire process, turning it into one of the featured stories in our cookbook chapter about learning from mistakes. As autumn arrived, we began offering specialized classes focused on holiday cooking. Our Thanksgiving workshop sold out within hours, filled with people who wanted to create memorable dinners without the stress and anxiety that often accompanies holiday cooking. The secret to holiday cooking, Jessica would begin these sessions, isn't perfection. It's planning, patience, and accepting that something will probably go wrong, and that's okay. We taught students to create realistic timelines, to prepare components ahead when possible, and most importantly, to remember that the goal was bringing people together, not impressing them with flawless execution. Eleanor, who'd become one of our regular students, volunteered to help with these larger classes. Watching her confidence grow over the months had been one of the most rewarding aspects of our venture. She'd progressed from someone who was afraid to deviate from recipe measurements to someone who could improvise entire meals based on what looked good at the farmer's market. Margaret and Jessica saved my relationship with food, she told a reporter who was writing a feature story about Heritage Kitchen. I went from being afraid of my own kitchen to loving the process of creating meals. They taught me that cooking is an act of self-care, not just a chore to be completed. The article brought us national attention we hadn't expected. Food magazines started calling, wanting to feature our unique approach to cooking education. A publisher contacted Jessica about expanding our cookbook into a series. Cooking shows expressed interest in featuring our teaching methods, but perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from our students themselves. David, the divorced father who'd been feeding his children fast food, sent us photos of elaborate Sunday dinners he was creating weekly. Sarah, the teenager who'd been reluctant to participate, called from her college dorm to ask for advice on cooking for her roommates. Marcus had successfully recreated his grandmother's cornbread recipe and was teaching it to his own children. You two have created something really special, Michael told us during one of our family dinners. It's not just about cooking. You've built a community of people who are learning to take better care of themselves and their families. Jessica and I had settled into a comfortable partnership that surprised everyone who remembered our rocky beginning. She handled the business aspects of Heritage Kitchen, while I focused on curriculum development and hands-on teaching. But our roles often blended naturally, Jessica stepping in to offer encouragement to nervous students, while I helped with organizational challenges. I can't believe I once thought Google could replace this kind of learning, Jessica admitted during one of our planning sessions. There's something magical about learning in person, about being able to ask questions and get immediate feedback, about sharing the experience with other people who are on the same journey. Our Christmas class that year was our most ambitious yet, featuring not just cooking instruction, but stories about holiday traditions from different cultures, discussions about creating new traditions that reflect modern families, and techniques for managing the emotional aspects of holiday entertaining. The holidays can bring out the worst in family dynamics, I explained to our students. Food becomes a battlefield with everyone having opinions about how things should be done. Our job as cooks is to create an atmosphere of warmth and inclusion where the focus is on bringing people together rather than proving our worth through perfect execution. We taught students to delegate tasks, to include children in age-appropriate ways, to have backup plans for dishes that might not turn out perfectly, and, most importantly, to remember that the love and intention matter more than technical perfection.
One of our students, Rebecca, was hosting her first holiday dinner for her new husband's large Italian family, feeling intimidated by the family matriarch, who is famous for her cooking skills. "I'm terrified they're going to judge me," she confessed during class. "His grandmother makes everything from scratch, and I'm still learning how to roast a chicken properly." Jessica and I worked with Rebecca to plan a menu that played to her strengths while honoring Italian traditions. Instead of trying to compete with dishes the family had been perfecting for generations, we helped her create a meal that reflected her own background and personality while showing respect for her new family's culture. The goal isn't to replace their traditions, it's to add your own voice to the family story. Good food, made with love, will always be appreciated regardless of whether it's exactly like what they're used to. Rebecca's dinner was a tremendous success, earning her acceptance from her new family and, more importantly, giving her the confidence to continue developing her own cooking style. As our first year of Heritage Kitchen drew to a close, Jessica and I began planning for expansion. We'd received inquiries from people in other cities who wanted to bring our approach to their communities. Food enthusiasts from across the country were asking when we might offer online classes or video instruction. "We need to be careful about growing too fast," I cautioned Jessica during one of our planning meetings. "The personal connection is what makes this work. If we get too big, we'll lose the intimacy that our students value." Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that too. Maybe instead of expanding Heritage Kitchen directly, we could train other people to teach using our methods, create a network of teachers who understand our philosophy and can bring it to their own communities." The idea excited me. Imagine if we could help people all over the country learn to cook with confidence and joy, to understand that feeding people well is one of the most fundamental ways to show love and build community. We could start with some of our most successful students. Eleanor would be a wonderful teacher. She understands what it's like to be intimidated by cooking, but she's also learned to trust her instincts. And David has such a gentle way of encouraging other students. Plus, his story about learning to cook for his children would resonate with a lot of single parents. As we talked, the vision expanded. Heritage Kitchen could become a movement, a way of bringing people back to their kitchens not through intimidation or complexity, but through understanding, community, and the recognition that good cooking is accessible to anyone willing to learn. The cookbook was scheduled for publication in the spring, timed to coincide with Mother's Day. Jessica had created a marketing plan that focused on the emotional aspects of cooking rather than just the recipes themselves. "This isn't just another cookbook," she explained to our publisher during a planning meeting. "It's a guide to rebuilding the connection between families and their food, to understanding that cooking is an act of love that anyone can learn."
The book included QR codes that linked to videos of our teaching techniques, allowing readers to see the hands-on demonstrations that were such an important part of our classes. But more than that, it captured the philosophy we'd developed together, that cooking well is about attention, patience, and care, rather than perfection or competition. As winter deepened, I found myself reflecting on the incredible year we'd had. What started as Jessica's humbling experience with a disastrous Thanksgiving dinner had grown into something that was touching hundreds of lives, helping people reclaim their kitchens and rebuild their relationships with food. "Do you ever regret that first Thanksgiving disaster?" I asked Jessica one evening as we cleaned up after a particularly successful class. She laughed, shaking her head. "Are you kidding? That disaster was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to admit I didn't know everything, to accept help, to learn that some kinds of knowledge can't be Googled. And it gave us this," I added, gesturing around the Heritage Kitchen space filled with the lingering aromas of the evening's cooking lesson. "More than that," Jessica said, "it gave me a real relationship with you, with Michael's family, with cooking itself. I went from someone who saw food as fuel to someone who understands that meals are about so much more than nutrition." She paused, looking around the kitchen that had become our shared domain. "I also learned something important about myself. I don't have to be perfect at everything immediately. I can be a beginner. I can make mistakes. I can learn from people who know more than I do. That's made me a better person, not just a better cook." The transformation in Jessica had been remarkable to witness. The woman who'd once dismissed my old-fashioned recipes with supreme confidence had become someone who approached new challenges with humility and curiosity.
But more than that, she'd learned to find joy in the process of learning itself, rather than just in achieving perfect results. You know what the best part is? She continued. Watching our students have the same breakthrough I had, seeing someone go from being afraid of their own kitchen to loving the process of creating meals for people they care about. That never gets old. Our final class of the year was a celebration, featuring dishes that students had learned throughout our various sessions, prepared together as a community feast. Eleanor brought her recreated version of her mother's holiday bread pudding. David contributed a perfect roast beef he'd mastered for his children's Christmas dinner. Marcus shared his grandmother's cornbread, finally perfected after months of experimentation. As we sat around the long tables, sharing food and stories, I was struck by how much had changed in just 1 year. These people had arrived as strangers, united only by their desire to cook better for their families. Now they were friends, part of a community that extended far beyond our kitchen. "I want to propose a toast," Jessica announced, raising her glass of wine. "To second chances, to learning from mistakes, to the understanding that the best recipes aren't found online, but are passed down through relationships built on trust and shared experience. To Heritage Kitchen," Eleanor added, "for teaching us that cooking isn't about perfection, it's about connection." "To Margaret and Jessica," David said, "for showing us that the most important ingredient in any recipe is love." As our guests began to leave that evening, laden with leftovers and promises to stay in touch, Jessica and I stood together in our teaching kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a year well spent. "So what's next?" Jessica asked, already thinking ahead to our second year of operations. "More of this," I said simply. "More students, more stories, more opportunities to help people understand that good cooking is within everyone's reach." "And the teacher training program?" "Absolutely. Let's help other people bring this approach to their communities. The world needs more places where people can learn to cook with confidence and joy." Jessica smiled, the same expression of determined optimism that had carried her through her own learning journey. "You know, I used to think tradition was about doing things exactly the way they'd always been done. Now I understand that real tradition is about passing forward the essence of something valuable while allowing it to grow and change." That's exactly right. The recipes in my box aren't museum pieces, they're living documents meant to be adapted and improved by each person who uses them. As we turned off the lights and locked up Heritage Kitchen for the evening, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought us to this point. Jessica's initial dismissal of my old-fashioned recipes had stung, but it had also forced both Margaret and me to examine our assumptions about cooking, learning, and family relationships. Google might have infinite recipes, but it could never provide what we'd built together. A community of learners who understood that the best meals aren't just about following instructions perfectly, but about cooking with attention, intention, and love. That understanding, passed from teacher to student, from mother-in-law to daughter-in-law, from one generation of home cooks to the next, was something no search engine could ever replicate. And in the end, that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.